Compliance is really an essential component for every B2B startup today, and SOC 2 has become the industry standard for that proof of compliance. There is a lot of discussion right now around the cost, the quality, and the timeline for SOC 2. Wearing multiple hats is often the reason why companies aren't able to get to SOC 2 Type 2 as fast as possible. Those are kind of the common things that eat up a lot of time as a part of the process. The ROI on that, it really is going to be like a foundational requirement for your company. The one piece of advice is to start earlier. It always takes a little bit longer than you expected it to take. Hi, my name is Travis. I am one of the co-founders and Chief Information Security Officer at Workstreet. Workstreet is a modern cybersecurity compliance firm. We help companies build, operate, and scale security and compliance programs. We work with some of the fastest growing companies in the world. And today we're going to be talking about SOC 2 for startups. If you think about when's the right time for a startup to think about compliance, and in North America, that's almost always to think about SOC 2. It's become, over the last decade, like as soon as possible. So you will see posts on LinkedIn about like the software packages that you need to buy as a startup just getting started. And you have things like Carta and Stripe Atlas and Ramp and all these different things. And they typically will include like Vanta on that list. And the reason being is that compliance is really an essential component for every B2B startup today. If you're going to sell into another business, really any size business, but certainly any business that's mid-market or even large SMB up to mid-market, up to enterprise, they're going to want to see some proof of security and compliance. And SOC 2 has become the industry standard for that proof of compliance. Now, whether SOC 2 remains the industry standard is kind of an open question in 2026. There's a lot of debate about it, but right now, SOC 2 is definitely the industry standard. And for most startups, it's something they do very early in their life cycle, sometimes like pre-product, sometimes pre-revenue, sometimes when they get their first like bite of interest from a customer. SOC 2 has evolved in terms of how the market views it. And even today with that evolution, it's different for startups and larger companies in terms of how they view SOC 2, the reasons that they do it, and the value that they get out of it. For startups specifically, SOC 2 is really like a revenue enabler and a market opener. They're using it as a way, if they're really early, to help secure their first implementation or get through the procurement process of their first contract. As they start to find more product market fit, they're using their SOC 2 oftentimes proactively, like via Public Trust Center, to really accelerate deals and try to sort of proactively address any questions they're going to get about security and compliance. And so in that way, it really is enabling them to close customers, collect revenue, and ultimately grow their businesses. Really common question or concern that companies have, especially startups, that where everybody is sort of wearing multiple hats when it comes to compliance, when it comes to SOC 2, is like how much of the founding team's time or the one salesperson time or, the two developers that you have or product people, how much of their time is it going to take to do SOC 2? It's a great question. And it is a challenge because it's just something else to do. Wearing multiple hats is often the reason why companies aren't able to get to SOC 2 Type 2 as fast as possible. They know that it's something they need to do. If it's not a burning fire, like a contract that's dependent on having a SOC 2 Type 2 or Type 1, they might start the process, sign up for a platform like Vanta, and then get pulled into something else, like every small team does at like a small startup. When they get pulled into something else, then they're not spending their time writing policies, approving policies, doing risk scenarios, updating configurations in AWS, or fixing vulnerabilities, in your code, things like that. Those are kind of the common things that eat up a lot of time as a part of the process. So it's a legitimate concern for most companies. I think it's manageable, but it's certainly going to take a chunk of your time. So I think it in some ways comes down to how much you value those team members' times. I think it's Paul Graham or somebody at YC talks about a founder's time being worth $1,000 an hour. If that's the case, then I can say that definitively, like, time on security compliance SOC 2 is not as valuable at that super early stage. And it probably makes a lot of sense to look at a partner like Workstreet in the same way that a lot of founding teams look at partners at outsourced accounting and finance teams. It's just a way to sort of augment that small team, ensure that you're doing all the things that you need to do. You're successfully completing them so that you can successfully, obtain your SOC 2 report and do it in a way that's not slowing you down from selling or product building. When you think about the ROI for doing something like SOC 2, Type 1, Type 2, or ISO 27001, whatever it is that you need to do from a security compliance perspective, the ROI on that, it really is going to be like a foundational requirement for your company to build and to scale. There's no way that you are going to be able to get beyond, even if you can get through the first couple of sales to sort of open up additional sales and start to grow the business. So in terms of thinking about the ROI, like the biggest thing for me is you're going to spend a bit more upfront, building out the program, getting through your first audit. You have that for a full year. So the investment that you're making, if you're doing an ROI calculation, I think it's important to look at like what that looks like over at least a 12-month period, probably a bit longer, because again, like the price usually is a little bit less in subsequent years. But I think that's sort of the timeline to look at. And if you're starting to sell, you're starting to move, and a dependency of that is having a SOC 2 Type 2, then any deals that you plan on closing, whether you evaluate the direct revenue impact of those deals or the value, in a startup of like moving quickly, iterating and figuring out the thing you need to build that somebody will buy, which, in the first year or the first 10 or the first 20 or 50 sales is really more important than the revenue itself. Those are the things that I think you have to consider when you're thinking about the ROI of doing SOC 2 for the first time. There are a lot of compliance automation platforms today, and increasingly they don't even say automated anymore. They're saying agentic or AI, and that's true, but like they are automated compliance platforms. And so the biggest one, and really the premium on the market, is Vanta. Vanta's biggest partner at Workstreet. 3 categories is where compliance platforms like Vanta really shine. So one is they have pre-built like hundreds of integrations into different systems, whether those be like Google Workspace or Microsoft Teams or a cloud platform like AWS, GCP, Azure, or even like HRIS systems like Rippling and GitHub. Really, there's kind of a long list. It's in the hundreds. So those integrations really like automate the process of collecting evidence. So, you're having evidence that's streaming into these platforms and giving you like continuous visibility into what you're doing and how it complies with the frameworks and the controls and the tests that you should be complying with, or that you've said you comply with if you've done these audits. So that's the first piece is integrations. The second piece is they've really cross-mapped all of these frameworks. So if you start with a framework like SOC 2 or ISO 27001, you have a set of controls. Those are essentially things that you need to be doing, like encrypting data as an example. And then they've taken those controls, so they mapped them down to tests for different AWS services as an example with encryption. So they've done that mapping. And what they've also done is mapped those frameworks. So they've mapped the controls in SOC 2 to ISO, to GDPR, to CMMC, kind of on and on and on. I think Vanta has like something like 50 pre-built frameworks today. So that makes it incredibly easy once you've done one framework to extend to additional frameworks. So that's the other like big valuable thing that the GRC automation platforms have done, especially Vanta. And then the last one, which I think is not talked about as much in terms of value of a GRC automation platform, is the ecosystem that they have around them. So it's like a security and compliance ecosystem. That's everything from the technology partners that they have integrations with to pull data in, to automate that evidence collection, to networks of different auditors. So they have like auditors across a ton of different tiers that you can work with, down to managed service providers like Workstreet, who can support you with everything from pen testing to internal audit to like actually helping you build out and manage your security and compliance program. So I think those are the 3 core things where there's just a ton of value in compliance automation platforms. Now, when it comes to like operating those platforms, there's still a need for a human to do those things. And that's where there is still a need for time from the team of the company that's using these platforms to spend like, customizing, approving policies, keeping evidence up to date, fixing integrations that might break, rescoping sometimes integrations to include or not include certain things in an audit, updating risk scenarios, building and updating trust centers. So there's a lot of things that people still need to do. The platforms make it a lot more efficient to do those things, but there's still things that people need to do to operate those platforms. My one piece of advice, or my primary piece of advice to startup founders that are thinking about compliance, is the same sort of advice that I would have given myself, like 10, 15 years ago at my first company when we built out our security compliance program for the first time. And this was like pre-GRC automation, so we were doing everything manually. The one piece of advice is to start earlier. It always takes a little bit longer than you expected it to take, whether that's getting yourself set up and audit ready, or it's the audit itself, working with the auditor or getting the audit report. It always takes longer than you would expect it to take doing these things is something you're going to have to do anyway. So starting earlier is my primary piece of advice.